Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. So today it is finally time to set up our journals for the new year. I got a new bullet journal from Archie and Olive quite a while ago, and I am an affiliate with them, so you can use my code ARTandBujos to get 10% off, which also helps to support me and my channel. I got the Mint Gardener collaboration this time in this beautiful coral shade. I don't think it's still available since I already purchased it last year, but I got the same journal as always, which is a dotted A5 with 160 pages, and each page has 160 GSM, which is very thick, so there is never any bleed through with pens. As always, the journal has an elastic band in a matching color, as well as a black pen loop and two bookmarks. One of them has the little gold ampersand design, which I think is so pretty, and the cover is a linen texture with a gold embossed flower design in the middle. I always like to just put the elastic away for now since I don't really use it, and for this journal, instead of the usual page where you write down your name, there is just this beautiful illustration, which again was created for the collaboration with a watercolor artist named Sarah Simon, and then it just goes straight into the dotted pages, and the dots are a sort of gray color so they don't stand out too much. And now let's actually get into this 2024 setup. I wanted to choose a color palette that's sort of fun but not super specific to a season, so I ended up picking a minty green, a vibrant pinky orange, a very light beige for some of the backgrounds, and then a darker purpley or dusty rose shade. And this time I will also be using my Tombow Fudenosuke for some of the headers, as well as the Pilot Juice pen just to write with it because it dries very fast. The first page I'm making is a so-called key, and for those of you who are new to bullet journaling, this is where you can define which symbols you want to use for certain things like to-dos or events, and it can be as simple or as detailed as you want. I usually just kind of stick to the same ones since I've been bullet journaling for quite a long time, and these are the ones that just work best for me. They are partly based on the original bullet journal method, which was invented by a designer named Ryder Carroll, and I will leave a link to his original video in the description. I think it can be very helpful if you're new to bullet journaling. So for the tasks, I use a simple circle. Once I have completed that task, I will color it in. If I have to move it to a different day, I will put a little arrow on the left, and if it's cancelled, I will cross it out. Then if it's a more important task, I will mark it with a square, and then I use a star for birthdays, a dash for events, and a dot for notes. As you can see, I wrote the title on the top in this serif style font, but I left the thicker lines empty, and this is also the style that I will be using for the titles throughout this whole setup. And then to contrast it, since it's a bit more structured, I wanted to decorate the spreads with just some very simple leaves. So I used a bit of tape on the side to make sure I don't go over the lines, which makes it look a bit more clean, and then I used the three darker colors to draw the leaves. I made sure to vary the sizes and direction they're facing so it looks a bit more natural, and then I also used the very light beige in between for some smaller leaves to fill in any gaps. Then I removed the tape and colored in the line where the leaves start with the light beige, and then I also added a bunch of dots, which is something I love doing, to add a bit of a smaller element and then again make the space look a bit more filled out. I did make the dots a bit too big on this page, so I tried covering them a little bit with a white gel pen, and then I made them smaller on the other pages. Next up, I'm making a sort of cover page for the new year, and I first used the light beige to create a border in the middle of the page. I used the dots as a guide to make sure the lines are as even as possible, but of course you could also use a ruler, but I think since the color is so light, the little irregularities are not very noticeable. Then I wrote 2024 into the middle of the section with my Tombow Fudenosuke, and I used a font as a reference from Pinterest, and I sketched it out with pencil first. And then the most important thing is just to take your time with it. If there are any little mistakes, you can always correct them with a white gel pen or an acrylic pen. And if you're not confident in your hand lettering yet, feel free to print out numbers or just use some stamps for some of the other titles. I personally use the dots as a guide to make sure the numbers are the same size and that the spacing is even, and of course it's still never perfect, but I really don't mind it. Next, I used some more of the tape on the sides like before and then added the same leaves. I always alternated between the three darker shades and had them in the same order, so first the green, then orange, and then purple, and then green again, and so on. For the leaf branches, I always start with the stem and then I'm adding the leaves from the tip to the bottom of the stem because it makes the spacing a bit easier. And then for the length, I usually made clusters of 3 with 2 long ones on the outside and then the middle one being a little bit shorter. But in general, I just made sure to not make them all the same length because it can look a bit too monotone. Like I mentioned before, I also use the light beige in between sometimes for just some single leaves because it can help fill in any gaps between the other leaf branches. On the other side, I did the same thing, but I made sure to start with a different color so it's not perfectly symmetrical, just to make things look a bit more natural, but of course you could also make them mirrored on purpose. I forgot to move the camera a bit here, but I just continued all the way until the bottom, and then I removed the tape and added a few more dots here and there. I really tried to limit the amount of dots because I didn't want it to look too chaotic, so I just did 1 or 2 of each color on both sides. And that's those first 2 pages all finished, so let's move on to the next spread, which will be a yearly overview. Since this page will already be very full, I didn't want to add a title, and instead I just went straight into writing down the months. And a yearly overview is just what it sounds like. It's basically just a spread where you can write down every month, and then you can add the dates or leave them out. And then you can use it to write down birthdays or other events that will be happening later in the year, since usually you just create 1 monthly spread at a time, and that way you have a space to write down events for the other months in advance. I personally use it to write down the highlights of the month once the month is over because I think it's really nice to look back on, but of course you can use it however you want, and you can also make it a lot bigger if you want to be able to write down a lot more events, or even make it smaller or leave it out entirely. I started by writing down the number and the first 3 letters of each month as a little header, and I placed 6 months on 1 page so that I'm using 2 pages in total. This is the same sort of layout that I used last year, and in case you're curious about the spacing, each section is 7 spaces wide to account for the 7 weekdays, and then I left 1 space empty in between the months horizontally, and then there is 1 space of border on the outer part of the page, and then 2 on the inner part. For the titles, they take up 3 spaces vertically, and again I left 1 space empty in between the header and then the calendars that I ended up adding underneath, so it's not too cramped. Then I also have 2 spaces empty on the very top and the very bottom, and I have 5 lines underneath the calendars to write down my events, so in total the sections are 10 spaces tall and 7 spaces wide, with the exception of September and December, since they start on a Sunday and so they extend 1 space further down. But for the sake of the layout, I just kind of ignored them, and I really hope this was not too confusing. For the headers, I wrote the numbers in the same style as on the cover page, and then the months underneath in very simple lowercase letters. Again, I used the dark grid spaces to make sure they're more or less centered, so I tried to leave 2 spaces empty on both sides so that I have enough space to add these little leaves that you see me drawing right now. I alternated the colors in the same order as before, and this time I tried to make the 2 branches look even on both sides, but again, it doesn't have to be perfect. Then for the calendars, which are always the most tedious part of a yearly setup, I colored in the first line as a background for the weekdays with the light beige, and this is why I like having a very light shade as part of my color palette, because you can write on it and it's still very readable. Then I used the Pilot Juice pen for the weekdays and also for the dates underneath, and I make my numbers very small so it can sometimes look like a different number, but I actually didn't make any mistakes this time, and to make sure I don't, I always have my phone calendar on the side to double check on which weekday the month starts and ends, and also how many days it has, because for example February will have 29 days instead of the usual 28 this year, so that's definitely something to look out for. And to spare you the boredom of watching me write down 366 numbers, I will just skip to the end, but just take your time with it and take breaks if you want. Lastly, I wanted to add a bit of separation between the upper and lower part, so I colored in the 6th line underneath the calendar so that I still have the 5 empty lines to write down my events. And that is it for this spread. I really love how it turned out, and let's move on to the next pages. Now, last year was the second time I included a Themes of the Year spread, and I love looking back on all of the themes I make in a year and to have them all in one spot, so I definitely wanted to add it again, but this time I decided to make it a bit bigger, so I'm making it across 2 pages instead of just one. I started by writing one part of the title on the left side vertically, so I turned my journal sideways and wrote 2024 in the same style of lettering that I've been using for the other headers, and then I colored in a line with the light beige again, this time to the right of the title, so basically underneath it, and then I added the leaves on the right and left side next to the title to decorate it and fill out the space. I used some more tape because that way I don't have to worry about not going over the line, and then for the smaller leaves I used the thinner felt tip side of the Tombow markers. The purplish pink Ohuhu marker only has a fine liner tip on the other side, so I still just used the brush tip, but I just didn't want the lines to be too thick since the leaves are a lot smaller here. Then of course I added the small dots here and there, and then I moved on to the other part of the title on the right side, so I wrote themes in the same way as for the first part of the header, but so that the top of the letters faces towards the outer part of the page. I hope that makes sense. I did try my best to make the lines straight, but as you can see some of them are a bit wobbly and crooked, but you can't really tell in the end, especially since the titles are sideways. Next I added the light beige line again, which also acts as a bit of a border, and then of course I'm drawing more leaves next to the header. I thought this theme was perfect for a yearly setup, and I did a pretty similar one for last year and even the one before that, but I just think leaves are not too specific to any season, and they're also super quick and easy to draw, and if you're new to my channel, I'm all about quick and easy themes because as we all know, life gets busy and you don't always have a lot of time available to make a bullet journal spread, but definitely let me know what you think in the comments. Then I made the little boxes for each month, and the sections are 8 spaces wide and 10 spaces tall, and then I left 2 spaces empty on the very top and bottom again, as well as 2 spaces in between the sections, both horizontally and vertically. And lastly, there are also 2 spaces empty between the titles and the sections, so basically 2 spaces all around. I started by coloring in the first line of each section with the light beige as a background for the titles, and then I used the 3 other colors for all of the borders. I did also leave a space underneath the header because I didn't want them to look too cramped, and I alternated between the colors just like before. For the titles, I just used the Pilot Juice pen to write the first 3 letters of each month into the middle of the sections, and the reason I only write 3 letters is because that way they're all the same length and it looks a bit more clean and organized. And that's it for this spread. I can't wait to fill it out, and let's go ahead and move on to the next one. Now, since I am a YouTube creator, I need some space to write down theme ideas, and I also wanted some space to track my subscriber milestones. So on this left page, I'm making a very simple spread for my theme ideas for every month. So I'm first writing the title on the inner part of the page this time because I wanted to add a bit of variation to the layouts, and I wrote ideas as a header and kept everything the same to make the whole setup feel consistent. So adding the border with the light beige and then the leaves next to the title. By the way, if you do have any theme ideas, I would love to know, so definitely leave me a comment. I always like to keep a list of ideas, and I will of course feature a comment in my video if I do end up picking a theme from a suggestion. At first, I wasn't really sure how I wanted to split up this page, and I actually struggled a lot, but I ended up deciding on just a simple list of all of the months. So I basically split the page into 12 vertically, so that each small section is 2 spaces tall, and then there's 1 line empty in between each month, and that ended up working out perfectly in my journal. This time I also only have 1 space empty on the top, but I kept the 2 spaces of border on the left side as well as on the bottom to keep things consistent. I just wrote down the number and month again with the Pilot Juice pen, and then I added a simple vertical line alternating between the 3 darker colors again for each month, as well as some horizontal lines in the empty spaces with the light beige, which I partly forgot to record. Moving on to the other page, I'm again adding a title, and for this one I just wrote YouTube since this is where I will be tracking my subscriber milestones. Now, I think this year especially I learned not to focus too much on growth and instead just enjoy making videos and sharing them with you, since that's really why I started making YouTube videos in the first place. I do still think it's fun to see how my channel grows throughout the year, but I used to include YouTube and Instagram trackers every month, and I did notice that I was getting a bit too caught up with how many more subscribers I was gaining or if the growth was slowing down, which there will always be fluctuations, so I don't think it makes sense to focus on it too much. So for this year, I only wanted to include some bigger milestones in my yearly setup, and then just a small graph where I can see how my channel develops throughout the year. I really love the small community we have built together, and everyone is always so kind and supportive, so at this point I just wanted to say a big thank you for being part of it, and I hope I can continue to make videos you enjoy. And of course, for any new subscribers, I hope you feel welcome, and thank you for your support. It really means a lot. Anyway, I did forget to press record once again. Sometimes I'm just a bit too concentrated on what I'm doing, but I'm just making some small sections for every milestone. So I made 9 in total, using the 3 darker colors for the borders again, and the sections are 5 by 5 spaces with 2 in between them, both horizontally and vertically. I just wanted to write down the milestones in the middle, and then once I reached them, I sort of color them in with diagonal lines, which you can see in my 2023 flip through, where I made the same sort of layout. I used the light beige again as a background for the milestones in the middle of the sections, and then wrote them with the Pilot Juice pen again, and we're actually very close to the first milestone, which is 20,000 subscribers, and then I just continued until 25k, and from then on I skipped to 30k, 35k, and lastly 40k. For the graph that I mentioned, I kept it super simple again, so on the x-axis I wanted to write down the months, and then on the y-axis the amount of subscribers, which actually ended up working out perfectly. And then to fill it out later on, I wanted to use the orange and the purplish pink to draw a line from the bottom up to how many subscribers I have on the first day of the month, and then at the end of the year it will be a nice graph, which is honestly just something I like looking at, and I think it's just fun to make. So yeah, that is it for this YouTube spread, and I just have one more that I wanted to include, which will be a grid spacing guide, as well as my weekly layout guide that I made last year. For my grid spacing guide, which I will explain what that is for anyone new to bullet journaling in a little bit, I first cut out 2 strips of paper from the back of my old bullet journal because I wanted to make them sort of like a bookmark, and I got this idea from Tracy Revell, and I will link her video in the description. Then I rounded off the corners, which of course is optional, but I just think it looks nice. And a grid spacing guide is basically a cheat sheet for how you can split a page into halves, thirds, and so on, so that you don't have to count the grid spaces every time you make a spread, which can be a bit tedious. Now, I don't know if it's super useful for beginners, but for me, since I always pretty much go for the same layouts, especially for weekly spreads, which you'll see in a bit, I think these bookmarks will save me a lot of time and counting. And the reason I made 2 bookmarks is just because I wanted to have one for the height and then one for the width of the journal. But you could also just flip it around, which is what Tracy did in her video, and I think she explains it very well, so definitely check it out. Now, since the width obviously has fewer grid spaces than the height, I made a title on the top where there was the extra space, and I just wrote grid spacing and then decorated the top and bottom again with leaves. Next, I'm adding a line just for separation, and then I started writing down the numbers for the grid spaces, which in my journal there are 26 spaces horizontally and 38 spaces vertically. Of course, you can include however many guides you need depending on what kind of sections you use most, but for the horizontal bookmark, I just added one for splitting a page into 2 sections, one for a specific kind of layout where there is a kind of border either on the outside or inside of the spread for some decorations, one for when I'm making my habit trackers, and lastly one for when I make my monthly calendars, which are always the same size. This will probably not make a lot of sense to you if you're new to my channel, but again, you can add whatever guides you want or make sense to you, or just leave it out if you don't think it will help you. Then I did the same thing for the vertical bookmark, and I will use this one mainly for my weekly spreads where I have a few go-to layouts that I switch between, which you will see on the next page. I also wrote down how long the lines are, so how many grid spaces they include, but I did forget to do that for the vertical one, but you can also just leave them out. To make sure they don't fall out of the journal, I used a bit of washi tape and put it on the back, and then I just placed them on the left page, but you could also put them into the back pocket if that's more convenient to you. Lastly, for the other page, like I mentioned, I'm making the same layout as last year for some of my most frequently used weekly layouts. Again, this is very specific to my style of bullet journaling, but over the years I have noticed that I tend to make the same layouts for my weekly spreads, and this page makes it a lot easier and quicker to create my weekly layouts every time. I've gotten a bunch of questions on how this works and how I use it, so I will try my best to explain it, but of course if it doesn't make sense to you, there's really no need to include it in your own bullet journal. Basically, I draw a few mini versions of the layouts I use most, just so that I have a visual for how many sections I make, how big they are, and where I place them, and then I add the sizing for the sections as well as how many spaces I leave empty in between the sections, so it's pretty similar to the grid spacing guide, but specifically for my weekly spreads. So here I'm first making the borders for the mini versions. I have 6 layouts that I use most, and each of these boxes represents one spread with 2 pages, and I use the 3 darker colors for the borders, and the sections are 10 spaces wide and 6 spaces tall. Then with the light beige, I'm just drawing some boxes which represent the sections I make in my weekly spreads. So these are usually for my weekdays, and they're really just there so that I can see which layout it is. So the first one is a spread where I split each page into 4 equal sections. In the second one, I split each page into 6 square sections, so 12 in total. The third layout has 8 horizontal sections, 4 on each page, and more space on the outer part of the pages for decoration. And the fourth one is the same, but the other way around, where the decorations are on the inner portion of the page. The fifth layout is one where I have 8 sections in total, but they're a bit smaller and they're sort of offset, so the first 2 are placed higher than the next 2. And then the last one also has 8 smaller sections, but there's space in the middle of the page horizontally for, again, some decoration. Lastly, I just write down the dot grid spaces for the height and width of the sections, as well as for the empty spaces I leave in between them, and also on the outside of the spread. And then each week I just usually look at this page and see which layout I want to use for my next weekly spread, and I just have them all on one page. And with that, we are all finished, so let's do a little flip through. Whether you're just starting out with bullet journaling or you've been doing it for a while, I really hope this video was helpful and could give you some new inspiration. Of course, every bullet journal is unique, and feel free to include any sort of spreads you want. For example, I usually never end up filling out spreads like goals or things to check out, which I used to include in the past, but of course that's totally fine too. And that's the fun of having a bullet journal, because you get to try out new spreads and see what works and what doesn't. If you have any questions, suggestions, or ideas, definitely leave me a comment down below. I always love reading them, and I try to reply to every single one of you. And just as a little heads up, I won't be able to film my January setup until after the new year has already started, so it will probably be out at the beginning of January. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope I'll see you again next time. Bye!